Welcome to the fifth podcast on producer theory. In this podcast, we will explain what perfectly competitive markets are, the concept of opportunity costs, how firms maximize their profits, how competitive firms decide on their supply, and finally, we will explain the concept of producer surplus. What does perfectly competitive market mean? It is a hypothetical market where competition is at its greatest possible level. It means that there is a large number of firms on the market, thus a great level of competition. In such a situation in particular, it doesn't make sense to identify your rivals. In particular, three properties must be met such that we can speak of perfect competition. First, all firms are price takers, which means that firms' decisions do not influence the market price. All firms take the price as given on the market. Second, products are homogeneous in the sense that they are identical or nearly identical. Think of bread in general, for example. There are different sorts of bread, but we consider the product bread in general without distinguishing the sorts. Third, there is a free market entry and exit. So that means it is easy for a firm to enter or leave an industry. In particular, there is no government regulation on this market and no restricted access to resources, for example. Of course, not all markets look like this. Not all markets are perfectly competitive, but it is a good benchmark against which other real-life market structures can be compared. A case of monopoly, for example, where there is only one supplier on the market, will be analyzed in podcast 7 on market failures. Before we describe in more details what profit means and how it is formally considered in economics, we need to make a difference between economic and accounting profits. Accounting profits are sales revenues minus accounting costs, while economic profits that we are interested in are sales revenues minus economic costs. So what's the difference between accounting costs and economic costs? Economic costs also include opportunity costs, that is, the loss of potential gain from choosing another alternative when you've decided to choose one particular alternative. For example, you decide to go for a 1-hour walk with your dog. Do you incur any accounting costs? Probably not, unless you decide to buy something on the way to your dog. Now, do you incur economic costs? Yes, you do, because during this time of 1 hour, you could do other things, such as working more and earn, for example, 100 kronas. In this sense, you incur an opportunity cost of 100 kronas, and that represents the economic costs. Now, let's dig into the concept of profit. So the economic profit is defined as the difference between total revenues from sales, denoted by TR of Q, and the total costs you incur, denoted by TC of Q. TR of Q is your revenue from the sales of a quantity Q of goods, and this is simply the price of the market times the quantity you sell. And TC is the total cost incurred from the production of the same quantity Q of goods, and this is the sum of the fixed cost, FC, and the variable cost, VC of Q. So we distinguish between the variable cost and the fixed cost. The variable cost varies with the output Q. So for example, to produce more chairs, say, you need more wood, where wood is here an input to the production of chairs. Similarly, to produce more of any product, you will probably need more workers, so it implies more costs in terms of salary, and that depends on production, on the number of chairs you're going to produce. On the contrary, the fixed cost is independent of Q. For example, if you decide to open a bakery, you need to buy the necessary equipment like a big oven. You will use this equipment for a certain period, and only in the long run, the oven may be replaced by a new one. The cost you incur from buying the oven doesn't depend on the quantity of bread you produce. Costs are a central concept in producer theory. In particular, it is important to understand what marginal costs and average costs stand for. The marginal cost is the change in cost resulting from the production of one additional unit of output. So MC of Q is formally the first derivative of the total cost with respect to Q. Since total costs are equal to the variable cost plus the fixed cost, which does not depend on Q, the marginal cost is also the derivative of the variable cost with respect to Q. The average cost is simply the total cost divided by the total output Q. And the average variable cost is simply the variable cost divided by the quantity you produced, Q. Let's illustrate that graphically. Here are three curves. The red one is the marginal cost curve, the green one is the average cost curve, and the blue one is the average variable cost curve. We assume that marginal cost is first decreasing with produced quantities and then increasing and convex in the quantities. What's the intuition behind such a pattern? If you have a factory that was designed to produce 400 cars a day, if you only produce 50 cars a day, slowly increase the number of cars produced per day until, for example, 100 cars. The cost of producing one more car might decrease because, for example, workers work more efficiently in the beginning of production. But from the production of 100 cars, producing one more car sort of satiates the efficiency of workers. And the producer needs to employ more workers, which is more costly, hence the increase of the marginal cost. So the marginal cost may decrease first, but then starts to rise because fixed factors constrain productions. Now, what about the average variable cost in blue? This is very much related to the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost falls first. This means that what you produce more is actually cheaper than the average cost of producing all the previous units. So if the marginal cost falls and is below the average variable cost, then the average variable cost has to fall as well. But at some point, the rise of the marginal cost kicks in, particularly as soon as the marginal cost is above the average cost. Then the average variable cost must rise. The intuition behind this is that as soon as the next unit that you produce becomes more expensive than all previous units on average, then your average variable cost has to go up. That is also why the marginal cost curve intersects with the average variable cost curve at its minimum. So we can say that the average variable cost falls whenever marginal cost falls, or is at least below the average variable costs. Finally, the average total cost in green must be higher than the average variable cost. Why? because it also includes the fixed costs. The average total cost is initially falling for two reasons. First, this is because the variable cost is falling. Second, the fixed cost per unit of Q decreases as you increase the quantity you produce. Imagine you have a fixed cost of 1,000 kronas. If you produce 10 cars, then the fixed cost per unit is 1,000 divided by 10, so 100 kronas per car. If now you produce 100 cars, the fixed cost per unit is only 1,000 divided by 100, so 10 kronas per car. Before it was 100 kronas per car. So the more you produce, the lower the fixed cost per unit you produce. As with the average variable cost, at some point, the rise in the marginal cost intersects with the average cost curve, and this happens at the minimum of the average cost curve. So say we are producing Q star units of a good. The curve you see here is the marginal cost. What is the variable cost of producing Q star? Graphically. Since the marginal cost is just the first derivative of the variable cost with respect to Q, then the variable cost of producing Q star is the entire derivative of the marginal cost from 0 to Q star. So graphically, the variable cost is just the area below the marginal cost curve. Now let's turn to the objective of the producer. The producer aims at maximizing her profit. She chooses her output Q such that her profit is maximized given the market price, P. Remember that the profit is the total revenues, TR of Q, minus the total cost, TC of Q. The first order condition leads to the equalization between the marginal revenues, TR prime of Q, and the marginal costs, MC of Q. Since the total revenues are just the price times the quantity of the good, it leads to the rule in perfect competition, which is that the price is equal to the marginal cost. In other words, the firm will produce as many units of Q such that this condition holds. And from this condition, we can obtain the supply of this producer, which is the good quantity that she will supply to the market. Note that fixed costs do not matter for this decision since this is independent of the quantity produced. Also, note that the second order condition holds if and only if we have convex costs, or equivalently rising costs. Now, of course, we have fixed costs, and it plays a role in answering the question, when is production actually profitable? Well, production is profitable when the maximum attainable profit is higher than the payoff from doing nothing. So, formally, it is profitable to produce the good when the profit from producing a strictly positive quantity of the good is greater than producing nothing. Note that producing nothing boils down to only buying the equipment, but neither incurring any variable cost nor any revenues. So in this inequality, minus FC cancels out and allows us to rearrange things. Therefore, it is profitable to produce when the price is greater than the average variable cost. In other words, if the market price is higher than the average variable cost of the firm is better off producing something. If it is not the case, then it is better to shut down. So the equality between the price and the average variable cost is characteristic of what we call the shutdown point. Below the shutdown point, the firm is better off producing nothing. And above the shutdown point, the firm is better off producing something. Again, here, the fixed cost doesn't matter because the fixed cost is sunk in the sense that once you bought the equipment, you cannot be refunded for it. Let's illustrate this. We just saw that when the price is equal to the average variable cost, so when the red and blue curves intersect, we are at the shutdown point. Below it, so for any price P lower than PS on the graph, it is not interesting for the firm to produce. Her loss is exactly equal to the fixed costs. We also mentioned that the marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve at its minimum. This point is called the break-even point of the firm. This is the price, PB, from which the firm starts to make positive profits. At this point, profits are equal to 0. Above it, profits are strictly positive. And finally, below the break-even point, but above the shutdown point, the firm is better off producing something, but makes negative profits. This situation is associated with short-term production, since at the beginning of her activity, the firm won't be able to directly make positive profits with the first units of the goods that she produces. She will have to produce at least QB units of the good to cover her costs. Now, since we have defined what the shutdown and the break-even point stand for, we can distinguish the short-run supply from the long-run supply curve. The short-run supply curve lies above the shutdown point. This is the supply curve from the start of production, in the sense that even though the firm may make negative profits, first, because she has to compensate for her fixed costs in particular, she produces. The long-run supply lies above the break-even point. So this is the supply curve once fixed costs are covered. Lastly, we're going to see the concept of producer surplus and compare it to profits. The common simplification is basically what we also did for the demand curve. We assume here that the supply curve is linear. It is rising here, but note that it could also be horizontal. Say, for example, that price P is given on the market. Since this supply curve is derived from profit maximization, then the best that the firm can do is to produce Q star units of goods. Sales revenues is this green rectangle, since, as we already said, it is only the price times the quantity. And the variable cost is just the area under the supply curve. What is the remaining orange rectangle then? Well, we know this is the revenue sales minus the variable costs. But does it represent profits? No, it's not profits, because the firm also incurs fixed costs that are accounted for in the profits. So this triangle is called the producer surplus. It is very similar to the consumer surplus that was presented before. And this is actually the economic profits plus the fixed costs. To sum up, the producer surplus is the amount that a producer receives when selling the good minus the minimum amount she is willing to accept for supplying this quantity. This minimum amount is the variable cost because at least the variable cost is covered. Graphically, the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, but below the market price. Let's summarize what we have learned in this clip. So we defined the profit as the total revenues minus the total costs of a producer. And we went through the types of costs the producer incurs, fixed and variable costs. We also defined the concept of marginal costs, which is the support of supply. And the supply can be either defined in the short or the long run, depending on whether it starts from the shutdown point of the firm or the break-even point. Finally, we explained what the producer surplus is and distinguished it from the profits. The producer surplus is the sum of the profits and the fixed costs, or equivalently the revenues minus the variable costs.